The most enduring mystery in Berserk continues to be the existence of that pentagon of pure evil, the God Hand. Void, Slan, Ubik, and Conrad have influenced everything that's happened in the past and the present of Berserk. With Griffith becoming Femto, their set is complete, and while their ultimate goal remains somewhat vague, at least we have clarity on how they came into being. In this video, we're going to break down the history of the God Hand's creation, going over the process in detail, starting at its inception and at all the ways in which it could go wrong, if at all. So if you're not caught up with the manga, this is your spoiler warning, because there's going to be a few of them in this video. An egg, a sacrifice, and a heart torn asunder, the key ingredients required for the creation of a God Hand. Like any decent demon with a backstory, there are a few key ingredients that go into the making of a God Hand. Whether he intended to show that to us is a philosophical question now that he's no longer with us, but with the Golden Age arc, that's exactly what Kentaro Miura did. The Black Swordsman opening sequence was meant to establish Guts as a character, Berserk as a series, and the conflict between him and Griffith as the seed for a proper serialized run. But even during that arc, Miura-sensei was dropping hints about the God Hand's creation. There, he showed us how an apostle is created, and in a way, the process to create a God Hand is the same, only much larger in scale and much rarer in terms of occurrence. Humans turn into apostles thanks to three things: having inflated egos that are easy to throw into chaos and despair at a moment of crisis, having loved ones that they can turn into ritual sacrifices, and the most important thing of all, a behelit. Behelits are what brings the whole demonic operation together because they signal the chosen ones and open up their paths to ascension at the chosen moment by being exactly where they need to be. Behelits are the biggest mystery for the archmages of the world of Berserk because while they know what they do, they have no idea who sends them into the world or why. In chapter 202, Flora pretty much nails the function of a behelit on the head. By itself, the object is nothing more than carved stone. However, in the hands of one destined to receive it, it becomes a key to opening up the astral world and allowing the God Hand's influence to become more direct in your life. All human lives are influenced by them on a subconscious level. Lust, famine, greed, such things are implanted within the mortal man's psyche by these seemingly immortal beings. But with the behelit, the person who is destined to receive it becomes a physical manifestation of those concepts by transforming into a demonic apostle. Apostles are a heresy to mankind on a molecular level. Humans who chose to satisfy their egos instead of honoring the natural course of things and transcending their mortality to become thralls to evil. They hate and are hated, kill and are killed. Their actions often become the seeds that feed the fertile ground of esoteric evil in the story. For example, the egg of the perfect world manipulated an entire township into becoming players in a demonic ritual without their knowledge. Think of them as the batteries that power up the machine of evil. If enough of them cause enough misery, then the God Hand grows in power and influence, both directly and indirect. But this is also where the two entities differ from each other. Apostles are usually granted a tiny sliver of power that the God Hand possesses. That is because as physical vessels of evil, their power is limited. A regular behelit transports its user to the astral world and opens a hole in their hearts, which then becomes linked to the vortex of souls should they accept the God Hand's offer. This is what allows them to transform into their released states while maintaining a presence in the physical world. The God Hand is a purely metaphysical group of entities, and their creation process is actually the opposite of an apostle's in that instead of drawing out the abyss's power, they're pulled into it. When a human being becomes a God Hand, they don't just shed their identity as immortal, they transcend their existence as immortal and turn into beings whose presence spans space and time. Think of them as biblical angels, except that they're in the service of the devil instead of God. Like we mentioned earlier, the overall conversion procedure is basically the same as an apostle's, but scaled up. Usually becoming an apostle requires one, at best two sacrifices. The only case where we've heard of 3 people being given up during the ritual is during the ascension of Grunbel, and he's an exceptionally powerful apostle. Instead of 1 or a handful of people being sentenced to unwanted death, a much larger number is subject to that fate in the case of a God Hand. And instead of using a regular behelit, a crimson behelit is required. No other behelit found in the series is named apart from this one, and with good reason. Regular behelits might or might not disappear from the world after they've been used and their owner has passed away. We've seen Skull Knight ingest behelits that he's gathered from at least a couple dozen fallen apostles to form the Sword of Actuation, which suggests that as long as they're in the world, they'll be found by someone who will find some use for them. Perhaps the fate of a behelit shifts from one person to another when its contemporary owner dies. That's not the case with the Crimson Behelit though. It only shows up when a person marks spark to become a part of the God Hand appears in the world. By the time Griffith is born, it's already been used 4 times. Every party involved is intimately familiar with the procedure. He becomes the 5th and final person to use it. For his sacrifice, he chooses the Band of the Falcon because A, he needs a massive sacrifice and a few hundred men meet the quota, and B, despite whatever he consciously thought and said, most important people in his life were his soldiers. That's either the mark of a true leader or maybe a severely lonely man, because despite becoming a noble, Griffith held on to his mercenaries as his most precious possession. Maybe that was because his control over them was equal to nothing else in the world. He was a rather possessive and high-strung human after all. He endured in bringing life to a dream most men born better than him died chasing, so of course he needed a strong ego in order to survive. But with Griffith, things have a way of finding extremes, and when his ego was damaged by the one person he'd come to regard as an equal, he unknowingly primed himself for embracing his destiny. When the son died the 5th time for him, his crimson behelit shed tears of blood, and his physical body was placed in a cocoon as his soul descended to the depths of the astral world. There, it found the true master of the God Hand, and once he realized his place in the current of causality, his existence itself became a part of the astral world, and from the blood and souls of his fallen comrades, he was reborn as Femto, the prophesized Falcon of Darkness. We imagine Ubik, Slan, and Conrad were faced with similar situations in their lives, albeit out of the 3 of them, we can really only see Ubik being a politician like Griffith. Slan strikes us as more of the oppressed nun turned succubus type, and it's hard to get a read on Conrad because the guy rarely speaks. Each of them must have had their egos crushed as they realized their heart's desire would never come true, and when they were on the brink of death and madness, the Crimson Behelit gave them power. Each assumed a new role as a reborn demon king, with Griffith being the king of longing. The God Hand creation cycle comes full circle once every 216 years, so by the time the clock landed on our White Falcon, they'd had a lot of practice going through the process. However, it appears as though the curriculum was one devised by Void, because he's the only other God Hand whose birth we've witnessed, and it was nothing like Griffith's. The last human priest and the first inhuman sage. How the God Hand came into being. Chapter 362 confirmed something Berserk fans had suspected for a long time, that Void was the God Hand who destroyed Berserk City by turning its inhabitants into sacrifices. When was that revealed, you might ask? Well, think back to chapter 53, where Casca's torch illuminated several corpses that were a part of the necropolis that used to be Berserk's capital roughly 1,000 years ago. Chapter 362 shows us an ancient city covered in demonic tentacles with the vortex of souls lurking in the background, only it looks sort of empty. When we see the vortex make its debut in the last chapter of the Black Swordsman arc, it has a giant spiral of eternally tortured souls coming out of it as soon as it nears a dying apostle and a sacrifice in guts. When apostles die, their abyssal link pulls their souls inward, leaving their soulless bodies behind as the only physical proof of their existence. And as a branded individual, Guts is meant to be a sacrifice to the vortex as well. We see Skull Knight in his final moments as Berserk squaring up to Void and what looks like an older God Hand while holding his dying lover in his arms. She has a brand of sacrifice on her shoulder and the vortex is right behind Void, but no souls reach out for her. Of course, the vision cuts out before we see anything go down beyond that glimpse, but we think that those 2 things aren't a coincidence. You can check out our first God Hand Origins video for more on who we think these other 4 beings are, but for this video, we have to say that there's no doubt that Void was the one who started this whole God Hand business, and his eclipse looked more like the incarnation ceremony than Griffith's eclipse. Right before Guts snaps out of his blood memory, we see a brief shot of a large fiery brand of sacrifice engulfing what is presumably the land that used to hold Berserk City. The only other time we've seen this happen is when Femto returned to the world during the incarnation ceremony, and our key takeaway from that is the fact that this is the only time when Skull Knight actively compares Guts' situation to his own. From the moment he meets Guts on the ladder's way to St. Albion in chapter 142 to the moment Griffith is incarnated in chapter 175, the Wandering Wraith thinks to himself that all flows as though parallel to that time. He didn't make such an overt connection between his situation and Guts's during the actual eclipse, where he saved both him and Casca from a fate he himself ended up suffering from. We've always wondered why Skull Knight would think that way about the incarnation ceremony, which was, in essence, an imitation of the eclipse, but turns out chapter 362 was the missing link. In that chapter, we saw the first eclipse didn't leave behind behind a bloody lake, it drowned an entire civilization overnight. St. Albion might not have broken into pieces and fallen into a crater beneath the Tower of Conviction, but it was a scorched hellscape which was soon overrun with Kushan invaders in the aftermath of the Incarnation. Geiseric's entire capital became part of an interstitial point that was buried so deep beneath the earth it remains active until this day, and any who enter it are never seen or heard from ever again. The disappearance of Inquisition teams when he descended the Tower of Rebirth's Midland Pit has always puzzled us. If the depth of the crater was known to the royals, then surely they must have measured it at some point, even if they were just estimating things, for there to be zero success in discovering Geiseric's capital in centuries of exploration attempts by Midland's royal family. Surely something more than human must have been going on here. And it turns out there was. In chapter 138, we heard Void's backstory from Mozgus, and it gives us an interesting perspective on his rebirth. It's said that he was imprisoned by Geiseric for speaking out against his sins, and even through unimaginable torture, he kept pronouncing them to God until an angel was made to descend. In another story we hear about his time as king, apparently Geiseric's later reign was marked by gluttony, avarice, and lust, and he went from unifier to tyrant until God himself judged him for his actions. This is where we can address the causes for the God Hand's emergence for a moment. The idea of evil presents a rather cynical point of view of the world to whoever meets it. It says that death and ruin and suffering are all the things that it has given humans in abundance because they prayed for it. When the sage was imprisoned by his king, any rose-tinted glasses he might have been wearing with regards to their relationship would have been shattered. He'd have seen the true face of a man disfigured by evil's influence, and with his face a ruin and his brain exposed to the elements, that sage would have become the first in the world to truly understand that evil was in the nature of existence itself. Given that Skull Knight calls himself a foolish king after Guts witnesses his death, we can safely assume that he's talking about those last years and how he treated Void, because in more ways than one, the world is screwed now because of him. We know that for a sacrifice to have meaning in the world of Berserk, it needs to be personal to the one making it. Not just any lump of flesh will do, as Slan explains in Guardian Angels of Desire Part 5. A sacrifice to demonkind must be so great that it devalues one's humanity, making them ideal servants of evil. It feels crazy saying this, but what if Void was right, and he did love and care for Geiseric's people, maybe even more than the king did? What other reason could there be for him turning them into the first mass sacrifice to the idea of evil? He could have been a close advisor of the king's in his first life, considering he got both his subjects and his girl, but that is kind of besides the point here. The reason Void's ceremony was different was because he was created in a fashion similar to Griffith's reincarnation, and once he was reborn, he created the Invocation of Doom procedure to filter out the right candidates for becoming part of his army. It makes sense when you consider the disparity between the batch of corpses we found with the brand of sacrifice on their foreheads in chapter 53 and the ones we see being doled out to people throughout the series. Every branding chooses a spot at random. No two falcons were branded in the same place when Griffith sacrificed them, with only Corcus being branded on the forehead. With Void's sacrifice, there are only two clear groups: the forehead sacrifices and Geiseric's lover, who was branded on her arm. Maybe that was because she was wearing a crown on her head and it had magical powers. She was a rather powerful sorceress after all. But once all these people died, their life's blood and their souls rushed into Void's tortured and mangled body, and he was reborn as the hidden elemental king of empty space. Doesn't anybody find it curious that only Void can perform the Invocation of Doom, or that he's referred to and positioned as the Archangel of the God Hand? When it comes to headcanon, this is our greatest attempt at it, but here's what we think happened. Once Void reached his wit's end thanks to Geiseric's torture, he received the first Crimson Behelit from the idea of evil. This idea was born from mankind's intense desire to have their suffering and deaths have meaning beyond life itself. Even highly trained mages like Flora have never quite verified the existence of entities like the idea, and usually, humans only become a part of the spirit world after their deaths, as daemons. The fact that Void became the first human to be integrated into the spirit world, it must have required a ritual like no other. And incidentally, the incarnation ceremony was a ritual like no other. Hundreds, if not thousands, were devoured by malign blobs of blood that were possessed by the souls of the damned. And when the promised time finally arrived, these blobs rushed towards the roots of the egg of the perfect world who had planted himself atop the Tower of Conviction. All that flesh, blood, and soul rushed into the Behelit-like egg, who then hatched Griffith into the real world, giving his supposedly incorporeal body form. We think that Void's birth went pretty much the same way, but had the exact opposite effect. Instead of making him all-powerful in a world where mages and humans coexisted, it sucked him into the spirit world, where he then became one of the most powerful and influential influential metaphysical beings of all time. As evidence of the fact that Void's birth took him out of the physical world and put him into the depths of the astral world after the Great Roar, when the two worlds combined, Geisric's capital rose back to the surface. It was miraculously restored and somewhat remodeled to reflect Griffith's iconography, with the Falcon's Castle being one of its towering new additions. So, to sum it all up, the first God Hand's birth involved many of the things that all of the others involved, but it played out a lot differently than you'd expect. Because he was presumably the first servant of the idea of evil, he became its most powerful servant as well, and there have been hints throughout the series that he can see more than his kinsmen and do more than them as well. Whenever Void is questioned about the interjections of Skull Knight and Guts, he silently plays it off while the rest rationalize their limitations on interpreting the flow of causality. But the 97 anime had a scene where Slan implied that Void foresaw Skull Knight's interruption of Griffith's Eclipse, and we think this is a rare case of an anime addition turning out to be lore accurate. As the first Demon King, Void would not only have the most insight into causality's flow, he would also be able to create a system for swelling his ranks and ensure he retains control over it, thereby retaining control over them. The Apostles and the God Hand are given the directive to do as they wilt by the idea, but the hypocrisy of that statement is revealed in the fact that the Apostles are essentially slaves to the God Hand's will, and that the God Hand are slaves to the will of the idea of evil. However, they were all human once, so equal distribution of power doesn't work because at some point someone might try to rebel. Slan, for instance, really wants Guts to become an apostle, probably so that she can make him her boy toy, but she can't perform the invocation of doom, and Guts is said to be destined not to join them. If she could do that, she would have probably gone over Void's head and tried it out on him. As for the history of the God Hand's creation, well, once Void was in charge, he got to work on devising an army. He helped the idea send more Behelites into the world and create apostles that would serve their cause as they waited for another God Hand to appear in the cycle. He could have ensured that the Crimson Behelit only found its way to the Chosen Ones every time an eclipse was on the horizon. Though the set is technically complete with Femto, we're pretty sure it could be stretched out if the idea wanted it to. But such is our rotten luck, huh? With Griffith returning the world to a state of Fantasia, Void is now in a prime position to take his ultimate revenge on Geisric and take over the world that was so precious to him. But this also brings us to our last question. Is there any way to stop the birth of a God Hand? Considering the set's complete, the answer seems to be a very obvious no, but there is actually just one way to stop the birth of a God Hand or a demon of any kind, and that's for the owner of a Behelit to reject the temptations that it brings with it. See, most humans become powerless in the face of things they don't quite understand. They'll say yes to anything if it ensured their survival, and doubly so because they were promised power in exchange. Most apostles are too caught up in the surviving death, becoming stronger, and functionally immortal bit to realize they're dooming themselves and their loved ones to an eternity in hell. All those who get involved with demon kind invariably end up in the vortex of souls, forever churning in torment. The only time it hasn't ended that way for a person is when the Slug Count refused a second ascension to save the life of his daughter. Slug Count sacrificed his life to become an apostle the first time around because he couldn't bring himself to kill her. He was a devout nobleman, a faithful husband and father, a strong ruler, and yet his wife turned out to be a pagan cultist. She slew her fellow cultists in the middle of a ritual orgy, but he couldn't kill her, so he tried killing himself, and the God Hand gave him the option to lose his humanity and gain the strength to get his vengeance. He accepted because he wasn't really pissed at himself. In his mind, he was a coward for not being able to kill his wife, and becoming an apostle solved that problem. But his daughter had never done anything even a tenth as heinous as that, and despite his newfound existential status, the Count loved Teresia unconditionally. She was the only reminder of the human he used to be, the father he used to be, and to give her up would be to destroy everything he once held dear. So he chose not to do that, and was dragged into the abyss himself. We imagine this would also happen to anyone who refused a deal to become a God Hand, because there will be countless apostles gathered for the occasion regardless. If the Chosen One chooses their humanity instead of gaining demonic powers, then that's their right, but they should also know it's akin to signing your death warrant. Eventually, the God Hand will find someone egoistic and stubborn enough to manipulate into joining them, but if there was a way in which they couldn't, that would be it. It's a shame that there's no point in testing it out anymore because the set is complete and it's on the loose out in the world, but at least now you know the history behind the God Hand's creation. Marvelous verdict! And that's it for this video. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Berserk content. This is Wheezy249 signing off for now, but you can always find me on Twitch, and we'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.